This is a story about my mother, my father, and my true inheritance. Um, my mother grew up hungry. In the little adobe house she grew up in, there was often not enough food to eat and not enough paper for school. That's where she started when I called her one Sunday, like I do every Sunday. Normally we just talk, but this time I was calling to collect my inheritance, the story of her life. She was born in 1959 in a small, dusty town in the hills of northern Mexico called Santa Barbara de Tutuaca, and in English that means Santa Barbara de Tutuaca. Kind of like my name, kind of unpronounceable and untranslatable. But it was sort of like the Three Amigos, if you've ever seen that movie. The town of Santo Poco, very small, very dusty. The one paved road that leads into town quickly fades to dirt as you get to our house. And that house is not too much different than it was when she was born there. I go every 3 years to visit my family. It's got that same adobe facade, cracked walls, and sometimes in places peeling off to show the brick beneath. And on the inside, there's still the wood floors, and not the wood floors that like we have here, but the kind that actually look like they were cut from a tree, and you can see the dirt underneath. And the walls in the main room are this sunshine yellow, and all over the walls they're hanging like pictures of the saints and pictures of the family from, well, a lot of us are in the States now, so you got these black and white pictures of her parents, her family, and then color pictures of me and my sister and all our relatives that are scattered across Texas and Colorado and everything. She shared this house with 6 other siblings and her father. Her mother died when she was really young, and she doesn't have many memories of her, but her father was like a peasant farmer, basically, and that's what they worked on when they weren't in school. Her and her siblings would work in the fields, basically. But it was school that my mother loved. She was a star student, like in classes. She was the one that the teacher would point to have her, put a problem on the board for the kids to solve or tutor other kids. Like she was just that kind of student. And on the weekend, she'd come home and review her notes that she'd taken on secondhand paper, passed down from her siblings, because she was not the youngest, but, towards the bottom. And so, they handed down clothes and even paper. And I knew she loved school. She loved to learn. And that was her life, working in the fields and then going to school. But how it worked in Mexico at the time, or at least in her case, I don't know if it's how it is all over, but past a certain point, you got to start paying for school. It's only free up to like middle school. And her family didn't have the money to go on. And that's where she stopped the story for a second. And I knew in that silence she was crying. And that's where I really felt the pain of her poverty. Not just the hunger. She told me, Pablo, when you're poor, your stomach kind of shrinks and you don't feel it that much. And, when you don't have, I asked her if she even had like stuff like shoes. And she's like, well, I might have, but the rock still hurt my feet, so I'm not sure. But it was when she said she had to stop going to school because they couldn't afford it that I really felt the pain of lacking. And I wanted to cry with her. I shed a little tear because, I wanted to protect that little girl that was my mother and somehow make it okay. But I couldn't. And anyways, after a minute or two, she kept on going. And she lived in Mexico, or Tutuaca, for a few more years after that until her later teens when she decided to move to the big city of Chihuahua, Mexico, just about 300 kilometers north of there. And it's a city about the size of Colorado Springs. And like many girls her age, she was a house servant. And she worked for, people who needed babysitters, maids, stuff like that. And she didn't forget her love of learning, and she didn't forget her family back home. She was working as a servant to save up money for school, but every time she got paid, she bought a little food, bought a little supplies to send it back home to her family that was still hungry. And even though she had to make sacrifices on her part, she didn't forget her family, and that was something that I'm trying to continue today. But as a result of that, she really wasn't saving up enough to be able to go to school. And that was painful. The whole lifestyle was kind of painful from how she tells it. Like, they didn't treat her very well. Sometimes there's one lady said just didn't pay her. Sometimes this other lady who she worked for drove her around to work for other family members without paying her. One other lady, her living conditions were not brutal, but she slept on the floor with a blanket. That was her accommodations in that household. So working very hard to try to achieve this dream of going to school, but not forgetting her family. And I knew where her priorities were, because when it came to one or the other, she chose her family. And because she kept on sending money, food back home, she wasn't able to go to school. And that realization that she wasn't going to go to school was the second time she stopped. And then I realized, oh man, that something inside of her died. And again, that's where I felt the pain of her poverty. Going a little bit hungry, sleeping on the floor, working really hard. Those things are hard, but I really felt it. I really felt the pain when she couldn't go to school. But it didn't die totally that day. What happened was she, like many other in her age and anybody who wanted to advance themselves, decided to go north to the States. And her and a couple of friends, one day, went to Juarez, and I'm not sure the exact circumstances of it, but her and a few friends, they found a coyote, showed them a good spot to cross, and her, as she tells it, she was just the clothes on her back and a bag of some possessions, and she starts wading into the river, and it was apparently the rainy season because it was really high and really dirty. And she gets deeper and deeper, knee deep, waist deep, chest deep, and then it starts sort of carrying her away. And then she tells me, yeah, I couldn't swim. And I was wondering what her plan was, just was she going to get across on willpower alone? And she might have, because she's that kind of woman. But that's when she said, El Señor me mandó un ramo. He sent me a branch. And she caught it and floated across on that. And anyways, when she came to the States, she went to Fort Bliss, Texas, and that's where she met my dad and continued working as a house servant under not very good conditions. But my dad, this is kind of a different story. He grew up in Cuba, very rich, before the revolution. Like, if you've ever seen the television show Dallas, that's what he says it was like. Like wealthy people scheming, lying. They were politicians, lawyers, doctors, very well off, and they all lived together in their grandfather's mansion. And his grandfather, actually, he was poor. He said they lived in a shack before he made it big, selling cattle. And the story is that before they left that shack into the mansion that the family all lived in, he had them take a picture in front of it so that they would always remember where they came from. But apparently that lesson was lost. Like I said, the money got to them, and they just forgot the lessons of the past, apparently. And anyways, my dad grew up in this environment of privileges. Like, he had chauffeurs, well, not him, but his family, they had chauffeurs, cooks. If he didn't like something that the cook made, his grandmother would say, oh, take it back, bring us something else. And that sort of poverty that my mother knew was just totally foreign to him. But everything changed in 1959, the year my mother was born, and the year of the revolution. Now, if you know your history, that's when Castro came to power, and obviously his class was no longer the favored class in Cuba. And so he, like many other Cubans at the time, left with basically the clothes off their backs. And for my father, big important detail, his father died when he was like 11. So in just a few years, lost his father, lost his home, lost his country, ended up in Miami. And that's where he started to learn poverty. But that's also where he started to explore the world too. I imagine as maybe cultured as he was, having that education that comes with class, I imagine he was kind of sheltered, but that's where he started to go into the world and get his hands dirty. And I remember he would always enchant me with these stories of his explorations in the world, his physical travels to different countries, and his explorations through different philosophies, different religions, even witchcraft. And he was telling me about how he practiced this stuff. He's like, yeah, Pablo, I could read palms and tell the future. I could see through other people's eyes. And I was just like, wow, this stuff is like from Indiana Jones or something. And that really formed who I wanted to be. I wanted to grow up and have a life as adventurous as my dad. And the lesson I always drew from that was summed up in something he may have said only once, or he may have said it many times. I just know that it stuck out a lot in my mind. Was he said, when I was just wide-eyed, he's like, son, I know because I did it. I know because I did it. Other people can read books and hear things from other people, but I was there. And that really informed how I wanted to learn. And so that was sort of my father's influence on me. And anyways, so he becomes a soldier. That's how he does all this traveling and stuff. And that's how he ends up at Fort Bliss, and that's how he meets my mother. And they get married, and that's the first time my mother ever had enough. And that was very... I breathed a sigh of relief when she got to that part of the story. It's like, finally, now I can untense that, knot in my lungs and just, okay, it's going to be okay. We have enough. And then she had my brother, Lloyd, and then my sister, Esmeralda. And by the time I was born, we were in Germany, which unfortunately I don't remember any of because I was too young. But that whole time when she was in the States, she basically taught herself English. She may not have been going to college or going to university or whatever, but she was teaching herself. There was that hunger for knowledge that nothing could stop. If somebody wasn't going to give it to her, she was going to take it. And so when we were in Germany, there was the military newspaper, the Stars and Stripes, and she told me that's how she taught herself English, listening to the radio, reading Stars and Stripes. And by the time we came back to the States, this was in Lawton, Oklahoma, where my memory starts, she said she was taking English classes. And she remembers this one teacher. She would always grade her really hard. She'd look around at all the other students at their papers that they turn in, and they wouldn't have too many corrections from the teacher. They called them bloody papers because they had red ink, all over. And so she said she got a lot of bloody papers from that teacher. And she thought she was like being picked on or something. So she went up to the teacher one day and she's like, why do you always give me so many bloody papers? And the teacher said, I grade you so hard because I can see that you really want to learn. And that was really touching to me. I was like, yeah, go mom. I was just really proud of her, like that moment. And that's my parents. That's what my parents give to me. I'm not going to get any heirlooms or a big estate or lots of money, but I am so rich on the inside because of that hunger for learning that my parents gave me. I know because I did it, and so I go and do everything I can to just taste the world, the good and evil of it. And my mother's desire to never stop. If somebody's not going to just give me knowledge, I'll take it, I'll find a way, I'll sneak my way in, I'll talk my way through. But the desire to learn is my parents' true inheritance to me. And how that's played out in my life, I actually didn't go to college after I graduated from high school. I was going to go to this military university, and I'm glad I didn't end up doing that because that wouldn't have been the right course at the time. But I didn't stop learning just because I graduated from high school. I started seeing a psychologist because I just had some things I needed to work on, and that changed my life. I learned so much, did a lot of reading from what my psychologist recommended, and just because I loved reading and I wanted to take advantage of this time I had. And eventually I had this idea. I was like, I want to just travel and see the world like my dad did and not have like a mediated, safe experience, but I just want to go out there. So I got a job at Whole Foods, and I worked there for a few months with this idea in my mind. And I was still maybe not going to do it, but one day my friend Tyler calls me, and he's like, hey, Pablo, I'm going to go down to Texas for a few weeks for a seminar. See you in a bit. I'm like, okay, Tyler, see you then. And then he calls me like a week later, and he says, hey, Pablo, guess where I am? And I say, Texas? He's like, no, I'm in California. I'm like, how'd you get there, Tyler? And he tells me how after this seminar, he basically by happenstance broke his plans and just hitchhiked and ended up in California. That was not the plan at all. He was supposed to come back after a week, but he was in California after a week. I'm like, oh, okay, that's pretty cool. And just sort of vagabonding around. And then he calls me like a week or a month later, hadn't heard from him in a while, and then he's like, hey, Pablo, guess where I am? Like, California? He's like, no, I'm in Idaho. I'm like, how'd you get there, Tyler? And he tells me another story of how he crossed the country and hitchhiking and truckers and all that. And then I was like, yes, I have to do this. So I saved up a little money from Whole Foods, and I went traveling to see the world, to know the world like my parents taught me. Maybe that's not how they would have wanted me to do that, but I think that's really what they taught me. And I went around the Northwest, got to experience a little bit what it was like to be homeless, got to sort of let go of control, let go of my possessions, and that changed me forever, for the better, I think. Discovered this thing called Rainbow Gathering, which is pretty much exactly what it sounds like, this big hippie gathering in the woods. I mean, I didn't even know there were hippies anymore, but apparently the culture is still alive. And that was really shocking for me, coming from, very safe suburban Colorado Springs. And that was life-changing. And then that was for a few months. And then I went out east and went all up and down the East Coast. Got to experience a little bit of the Occupy movement. Was in Occupy Tampa, Occupy DC, and DC was amazing because I'd never been in that city before, but the occupation was camped out in the middle of like downtown DC, and so the Capitol building was just, I don't know how far away it was, but you could see it. The White House was like 3 minutes this way, and then the National Mall was like 3 blocks over, and here I was with Occupy Wall Street, and just in the middle of this historic place, and nothing but like, my little tent and my jacket. I'm like, I'm in DC, wow. And so I did things like that, never stopped writing, never stopped reading, never stopped studying. I wasn't there so much as a protester as much as just a philosopher, someone wanting to learn and see. And now looks like the next course of my life is going to be to join the Marines. I'm enlisting, and aside from all the usual reasons, one thing I want to do is I just want to learn. I want to meet all sorts of people. I want to taste the good and evil of the world, and experience, know for myself, and never stop learning. So, anyways, whenever my mom and I wrap up our Sunday conversations, she always asks if she can pray for me, and I always say yes. And she's like, okay, thank you. Dear Jesus, thank you that I get to talk to Pablito today. Wherever he goes, please protect him. Protégelo, Señor Jesús. Cuando duerma, guarde sus sueños. Donde camine, guarde sus pasos, Señor Jesús. Aleluya. Y donde duerma, guárdelo, Señor Jesús. Que tenga salud de sus pies a la cabeza, Señor Jesús. Amen. Thank you.